Dear listeners, welcome to another episode of Magical Professions podcast. Who are witches? What types of witches exist? What does it mean to be an urban witch or a green witch? What is the fascinating history of witchcraft and how has it evolved over time? How do magic and science intertwine? And what this connection reveal about the role of witchcraft in human understanding? What qualities does one need to embrace this mystical path? How does someone become a witch? And is there any formal education for this unique calling? And what about the broader world of magical professions? Today, we're diving deep into these questions with our special guest, Shaun, also known by his witch name as Silvercrow, a green urban witch who brings together the natural and the mystical in everyday life. So join us as Silvercrow shares insights into his practice, dispels common myths, and guides us through the enchanting world of witchcraft and magical professions. Welcome, Shaun. It's a great pleasure to have you on our podcast. Thank you so much for joining. And can you briefly introduce yourself and also where you are joining us from what part of the world? Thank you.
Hi, Melina, and thank you very much for having me. I'm joining you from Nottingham, which is right in the centre of England, right over in the UK. It's kind of in the centre of what used to be Sherwood Forest, so sort of Robin Hood country, and with the tales of Robin Hood and all of that used to happen. So it's kind of right in the centre of all of that. So ancient magical origins, you could say.
Yes, and it's really an honor to have you on our podcast. So you're from the place, like you said, with all the origins, which is amazing. Thank you so much for joining. And I had a privilege to live in the UK. I lived in Manchester. But for about a year, I studied at UMIST. And I traveled a lot. So we had that wonderful student society, which allowed us each weekend to visit some part of the country. And you are bringing all those wonderful memories. So thank you so much. So thank you.
Yeah.
And let's start figuring out what are witches. And maybe we can start with just some definitions, at least in how you define certain things, that it would be easier for us to follow the conversation. First of all, when you're talking about witches, and I listened to your podcast and some of your other recordings, which I appreciate you doing, and you are often talking about witches and magic. So let's maybe start with the magic as a broader field. And how do you define magic in the first place?
So in terms of my practice particularly, and witches in general, there are different kinds of witches. There's lots of, each witch will have their own individual practice, their own way of working. Magic in this context is more about the connection with the natural energies that exist around us and the utilization of the natural order of things, natural cycles, seasons, weather, and all of the, I guess you could say, the energies that are surrounding us all the time. And I think there's a misconception that magic is something that's of the supernatural, and it's not really. Magic is a completely natural phenomenon. And the idea is that it's, we see things all the time that could be regarded as magical. We often kind of look at them through the lens of the mundane, but mundane things can also be magical. I don't think anybody would say that watching a beautiful sunrise in the morning is not a magical thing, and how the rain and the frost kind of highlights a spider's web. That's a magical thing to look at. And we all would probably say, yeah, it is quite a magical experience. And so the idea is that all of these things exist, all of these magical things exist around us, and we're exposed to this I guess, magical energy all the time, like sort of 24 hours a day. And so the idea is that we connect with that magical energy. It's about drawing the awareness to the things that we don't see all the time and then projecting our will outwards. So we connect with the unseen. You know, the word occult means that which is hidden. So we connect with the unseen and then we utilize that energy, that unseen energy, in order to transform things about our lives. And it could be something simple. It could be something as simple as, I don't know, something like going for a job, for instance, a new job or a career, you know, and you might feel not too confident, so you might need a confidence boost. So you could do some kind of spell or magical working to boost your confidence, for instance. That's just a really simple thing, of a simple way of doing it. But the idea is that you're putting your trust in yourself, you're having confidence in your own ability, and you're having confidence in the ability for the universe to deliver back the energy that you put out there. And that's kind of the fundamental basis, I guess, of magic in that sense.
Thank you. And now we go closer to witchcraft. So, who, in your definition, is a witch? And I also want to refer our listeners to the podcast that you recorded specifically to explore this in all the details. But let's just get a glimpse into how you define it and maybe just brief history of how this term developed.
I mean, the term witch it's had numerous connotations over the centuries, as you can imagine. And it is kind of a loaded word, I guess, even now. In dictionary definitions, you'll often find that the term witch is often described as to do with sort of harmful magic. And in a modern day context, that's not the case. You know, witches in medieval times, sort of in the 16th and 17th century, were very different from witches now. You know, the whole notion of satanic witchcraft came about then, you know, came about in that sort of period. Prior to that, in the 1300s and before that, witchcraft was just an accepted part of natural living. You know, everybody, every village, every culture had their magical healers, their witches, their soothsayers, cunning folk, and they were all regarded as magical people who could connect with unseen forces, who could utilize herbs and natural healing, and who would perform some form of magical ritual or ceremony within that particular society. So it was just an accepted way of life. It's only from when Christianity started to kind of creep in and sort of be developed and then take hold that magic and witchcraft started to become something of the satanic. And that wasn't for centuries. Like I was saying, it was only from sort of 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, really, was when this whole idea that witches were connected to the devil and Satan and demons and all of that stuff. Before that, that wasn't a thing. That wasn't the case. It was just regarded as folk magic. If you had a pimple on your face and you wanted something doing with it, you would go to a folk healer in the village. They would create some kind of concoction, perhaps give you a spell or some kind of chant or charm or something. And then you would go away and do whatever the instructions were. And the church perfectly accepted that for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's only sort of from that sort of 15, 16, 1700s that it started to shift and started to come before or up, and it started to be really turned into something of the satanic. So witchcraft in general is ancient. It goes back to the dawn of time. There's evidence in cave paintings in Peru and Africa and South America and Central America and parts of the UK where, you know, witchcraft has been practiced since humans first were able to stand on two legs. Magical practices have been practiced for thousands of years. So anyone can do it. So there's not a strict definition of what a witch is in that sense. In the modern sense, witches have took less of a sort of evil connotation, and we've kind of taken more shifting towards what they originally were prior to the 1400s. So that's kind of where it sits now. And again, you'll have differences of opinion. Some people will think that witches are still satanic and etc. And then others will see the whole healing and natural living type aspect of witchcraft.
Yeah, thank you so much for this explanation. And what really resonated with me that you talked about magic in general, and of course it's applicable to witchcraft as a connection to nature, understanding the processes in the nature, and we are a part of that. We are a part of nature ourselves,
Yeah.
and that's why we feel that magic inside us. And I think you mentioned this in your first podcast episode. And you also mentioned that we especially feel that connection when we are children, when we are
Yeah.
still little,
Yeah.
still growing. So,
Yeah.
why do you think is that? Why do you think this feeling of magical, it's particularly strong when we are still children?
I think when we're children, we're kind of new to the world. So, and we are unburdened by culture, by society, by rules, by regulations and restrictions that we place upon everybody else in society. I think as children, we don't have the baggage that comes with being an adult. And so, children, we live in our imagination. That's how children operate. Our imaginations are everything to us. Children develop imaginary friends. We develop stories and characters and games and all kinds of things that we develop with our imaginatory skills and our creative skills. Our creativity as children is completely off the charts. There are no restrictions, no limits. The problem that happens is, and I speak from an ex-school teacher. I was a school teacher for 20 years. I see this in action. And what happens is when children enter the school system, the education system starts to, not so much in sort of infant and primary schools, but particularly in secondary education, sort of high school and onwards. What happens is we drive our children towards programming and propaganda programming. We drive our children towards the expectations of what we want adults to do in society. Society wants adults to be working, contributing individuals who pay taxes, who contribute to the labor market and increase the economy. That's the only purpose of adults, as according to the system. Whereas children, when they're young, don't have any of that knowledge. They're not privy to that. So when they're very young, they have the automatic default setting of human beings. And the default setting of human beings is creativity and imagination. That is our default setting. We are beings of chaos. We are beings of stardust and collisions of vast quantities of cosmic gas and debris. So our default nature is chaos. And chaos is always a catalyst of creativity. Creativity comes from chaos. I think children are beings of chaos. They are beings of pure chaos. They don't have structure and order until we give them structure and order. And so I think when they're unburdened by structure and order, then they're free to allow their imagination and their visualizations to manifest themselves as they wish. It's only when we put them through the schooling system and we take that from them, we tell them that no, a tree isn't blue, a tree is green, and then that completely diminishes that magic. And we chip away piece by piece until that magic's gone and we forget how to do it. We forget how to play. We forget how to connect with nature. We forget how to imagine wild magical beasts and things like that. We forget. And so we grow up as adults, we've forgotten all of that. And then we get to a point in life, usually in our sort of middle age, in our mid 40s maybe, when it dawns on you that something's missing in your life. And the thing that's missing is we've forgotten how to be magical people. We've forgotten the magical beings that we started off as. And sometimes we need to put that back into our life. So part of what we do with Silver Crow is the idea is we want to reconnect people with their magic and help people rediscover the magic that they had when they were children and apply it to their present day circumstances. And that's the point, really.
Yes, I agree. And maybe you can recall yourself as a child. How did you feel that magic that surrounds you? And maybe you can share something with our listeners. Yeah.
Yeah, apart from which I'm trained artist, I always had a love of drawing and painting as a child. even from my earliest memories, I can remember drawing and coloring and painting, building things out of card and tape and all kinds of stuff. And so I was very firmly in my imagination as a young child. And that was kind of fostered by my parents and grandparents who encouraged me to draw and to paint and things like that. And they helped me by providing those things, those tools and those materials. And then as I sort of went through the schooling system and I got into primary school, I had a brilliant primary school teacher who also fostered that love of art and creativity as well. I had some early kind of foundations of that. And then as I grew, my love of drawing and painting maintained, right through my life. And it still does now. I still paint and sell my work. And my other job aside from being a witch is I'm a graphic designer and branding expert. I run a business doing branding and graphic design and marketing for people. So that creativity is still there. I love to create things from scratch. So it always was there. And I think a big reason for that and a big help to push that forward was my love of folklore and mythology and legends, fairy tales, stories in general. I love stories. I've always loved stories. And as I got older and particularly as I sort of embraced my witchcraft a lot more, what I realized is there are huge amounts of hidden knowledge within stories, within fairy tales, within nursery rhymes, folklore, myths and legends. They seem fantastical, but when you put them in the context of the day that they were written, you start to unpick real historical facts that those stories were based upon. And there's a huge amount of knowledge that we can gain from stories that we assume are childhood or products of childhood. And they're just not, they are all fairy tales and nursery rhymes and folklore. None of it was intended for children originally. It was all intended for adults. And it was oral ways of spreading oral information if you couldn't read or write. A lot of people at the time couldn't read or write. So the way of getting that information out there was to create these funny little rhymes and fairy tales and stories. And it was a way of telling the news of the day, and getting information out there, sharing knowledge. So it's a fascinating thing to dig into those things. And I did that a lot as a child. I studied Greek and Roman, Egyptian, African, Slavic, and Italian, Eastern European folklore, all kinds of folklore. And I sort of really became sort of quite addicted to absorbing folklore and myths and legends and so on. So it provided a good base, I guess, for my magical practice going forward. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And like you said, before we had writing, or many people were illiterate in old days. There were in Europe and in England, Philly bards that were going from one place to another place and bringing with their songs, with their poetry, with their different tales, in general, the wisdom that they collected over time, and also news, like you said. That's why we can find some historical basis a lot in those different tales, because yes, this is how people were bringing information from one place to another about the events and other relevant things. Yeah.
And that formed the basis of, I guess, my love for the unseen. When it dawned on me that there was a lot of historical information contained in these types of stories, then I started to look for where else there was hidden information. And the more I looked, the more I found, and the more I started to unpick, the deeper I realized it went. And so now if we take, just very basic practices that we do all the time, we blow birthday cake candles out. We often have round birthday cakes with candles in, and we blow them out and we make a wish. That stems right back to ancient Greece. And it was a form of pagan spellcasting. It was a ritualized practice. It was a form of pagan spellcasting, praying to the moon gods. And the circular cake was designed to display the shape of the moon. The candles were designed to represent constellations. And so when the candles were lit, they would be blown out in the altar of Hera or Selene, the moon goddesses. And it was usually by women who were about to have children. They were about to give birth. The cake was an offering that was left in the temple of Selene or Hera to help there to be a successful delivery, a smooth delivery of the child. because Selene and Hera were also goddesses of fertility and childbirth and motherhood. Just that simple act that we all do now on a yearly basis in itself is a magical spell. It's a magical act and a magical ritual that was thousands of years old. And we don't think about it because it's just ingrained into our society. But when you start to unpick simple things like that, certain phrases we say, certain gestures we do, certain little rituals and ceremonies that we do, and how we celebrate various different times of the year, all of those things stem back from this magical knowledge from a time when our entire existence as humans was based around magic. And we find it all the time. It's fascinating to discover all of that.
It is. And that's why it's so important to sometimes start looking at what we do and asking why. Yes, why we do what we do, why are we writing, let's say, with our right hand. No, I'm just saying, blowing the candle. Why are we blowing? Why are we making a wish? And we hope that the wish will come true if we blow those candles. Exactly why usually the circular traditional type of cake, and like you said, it comes to the moon. So we can cover so many things that really come from the early ages. And here comes that question about the origins of witchcraft in general. And you provided again in your podcast episodes a great overview of the history. Maybe you can share with our listeners just that basic understanding of where the witchcraft is coming, how far back does it date, and how wildly accepted and used it was over the centuries.
Yeah. Magic and witchcraft to our ancient ancestors was less a supernatural thing and more a way of life, an accepted way of life. And as far back as sort of prehistoric times, in our earliest incarnations as human creatures, there are cave paintings that date back at least 20,000 years or more. And even, way back to prehistoric times, they seem to depict forms of ritualized practices. They've found things like bones with intricate carvings into the bones, animal bones with intricate carvings. There's been uses for various different types of ashes and mixed with herbs to provide some form of kind of ritualized concoction that would be used and daubed onto the walls of the caves. There are burial mounds and henges that we have from Neolithic times. So magic, in terms of its connection to nature and its connection with the cycles of nature and the cycles of life, it dates back to our earliest prehistory, in what we would class as the dawn of time. It's before time was measured in any shape or form. And so as we kind of move forward in time and we get to sort of like the early Middle Ages to prior to that, even sort of Bronze Age and onwards, what we find is a lot of the magical practices, sort of early magical practice, it shifts from the magical practices that were designed around hunter-gatherers. Our hunter-gatherer sort of ancestral ways of life were very much governed by movement of people, by migration of animals, and the vegetation that was around at the time. And so we see a shift. There gets to a point in time, particularly from the Bronze Age onwards, there gets to a point in time where that sort of shifts and the practices stop being based around the hunter-gatherer way of life and they start to be based around agricultural ways of life. When farming starts to happen, then we start to see these ritualized practices start to shift in their focus of how they're practiced and why. And so we start to see gods and goddesses come onto the scene and be shifted towards agricultural issues, worshipping the gods and giving sacrifices to the gods and goddesses in order for a good harvest, for instance, in order for the weather to be favorable for the planting of crops. There tends to be a shift more towards folk magic, sort of addressing everyday issues for people of the time, things like childbirth, relationships, agriculture, things to do with animal livery, and all of the things around the day-to-day issues that the people of that time would face. So there tends to be a lot of basis around protection. Things like amulets and talisman are used quite a lot during these sort of periods. We find a lot of stone carvings and effigies of various gods and goddesses, and symbolism and sort of early language starts to sort of creep in and be used in sort of spoken language as far as using that for the gods and goddesses and sort of as acts of worship in itself. The speaking into existence, the states of being that we want, for instance. So you start to see these gradual shifts over time. And when we get to sort of the modern day, like our present day, what we have is the practices that a lot of witches now practice. The vast majority of witches now are Wiccans and kind of neo-pagan. And it's very fairly new, sort of 1930s, 1950s was really this kind of resurgence. Well, Wicca was created in around about that period by Gerald Gardner. He was drawing on different older beliefs from different parts of the world, and he kind of created a formalized, systematic system of magic, often used by a lot of witches today. But prior to that, witchcraft, and even now, witchcraft is very unique to the individual. My practice of being a green urban witch is very different to friends that I have that are Wiccan, for instance. I'm not Wiccan. I don't worship gods or goddesses. My only guiding force is the forces of nature, the cycles in nature, the seasons, the weather, and this kind of continuous cycle of nature. I don't tend to follow gods and goddesses. I don't tend to worship them. I see gods and goddesses as more of archetypes of our personality traits rather than beings to be worshipped. I think our power comes from ourselves. We create the world and the reality that we want to have. And so we are empowered to do that through projection of our will.
Thank you from this glimpse into the history of witchcraft and magic, and really dates way, way, way back. And what resonated with me in this part of conversation, that magic basically was a substitute for many things that now have a distinct areas of focus. For example, protection. Yes, amulets used for protection. So currently we have security. Yes, the whole field of security. And then, of course, health. Yes, so herbal medicine and how to help people, how to support during difficult times, not only people, animals. We have here, of course, all the clinical approaches right now that are being used. Also, animal care as a separate field. Then relationships, which is also very important. So now we have counseling, we have family counselors, psychologists that can help us with that. But there was none at that time. So really, witches undertook all those responsibilities, or majority of the responsibilities, upon their shoulders to help people as much as possible. So can you maybe talk a little bit more on that connection between witchcraft, magic in general, as it was historically developing, and science and health science as well?
Yeah, I mean, the science as we know it now, for me, I mean, I have obviously love witchcraft and I love magic and all of those things. But I also have a love for science as well, and I love history, I love science. And there's a lot of kind of talk within witchcraft where there's always this kind of back and forth of trying to disprove magic or trying to disprove science in some way. I think we shouldn't throw all our eggs in one basket either way. I think it's a dangerous move to always completely trust the science, as we have seen in recent history. I think trusting science, or the science as it's branded in certain places, I think trusting certain aspects of science isn't always a wise move. But likewise, trusting no science is also not a wise move. I think we have to be discerning, and I think that's the key aspect of anything that we do in life. We should always operate from a place of discernment. Having said that, with science, with magic and this kind of interconnectivity with science, I think science tended to be developed from magical practice. If we think about how we know what we know about the world and about the universe now within science, it's stuff that magical practitioners have been doing for a long time. The whole of the pharmacology and pharmaceutical industry has grown up around herbal medicine. And then it got to a point where they realized that they couldn't really put a copyright or a trademark on herbal medicine. So they had to imitate herbal medicine. And that's why we have pharmacology now. We have pharmaceuticals now. It all started from the early sort of alchemists and chemists back in the days, sort of apothecaries and alchemists and very, very early chemists that would have been regarded as sorcerers at the time. Witches and sorcerers were the early chemists, were the early scientists, were the early biologists and pharmacologists and so on, before science was a thing. You only have to go back to sort of Henry VIII's time and early Elizabethan times. And we have John Dee, and John Dee was the court's magician. He was the court sorcerer, but he was also an alchemist. He was also a learned man who knew how to create various different materials using chemistry. He understood about the stars and the movement of the stars and the movement of the astral bodies. He understood physics. He understood human biology. And so all of these were sort of early examples of scientific processes that were starting to, sort of move forward in time. And at the time, he was regarded as the eminent person in his field. And he was regarded as the king or the queen's alchemist at the time. And it was a position of prestige. And we still have a lot of John Dee's diaries and journals and grimoires that he created that catalog all of this stuff. So there's a very close connection, sort of science have grown up with that. I think these sort of early magical practitioners, cunning folk as they were called within the local communities, they would have been responsible for births and deaths as well. They would be the people who would deliver babies. They would also be the people who prepare the dead for burial or for cremation. They would be an integral part of that community. And so they had a lot of the knowledge of what we would class as science. Now, human biology only happened because we started to learn what was inside human bodies by dissecting human bodies. We had grave diggers and grave robbers that were selling the corpses to universities and so on. So the only reason we know all of that stuff is because of early occult studies about how the human body works and how the mind works and how the stars work and the moon works and so on. There is this interconnection between science and magic, and I don't think the two are completely distinct. I think there are huge crossovers. And as we're finding now within quantum physics particularly, quantum physics is now starting to explain some of the things that we've been doing within magical practices for centuries. How spells work, for instance, works on a psychosomatic basis. So we know from psychology that spells work in that kind of manner. The mind doesn't know the difference between reality and imagination. So if we can convince the mind that what we're doing with our hands, with our words, with our actions and our thoughts are creating something from scratch into thin air, then our actions tend to drive us towards the creation and the manifestation of that thing. And a simple example is you want to buy a car, you have the thought in your mind about buying a car, and then you might go and tell a partner or a colleague or a friend that you want to buy this particular car, and you have an idea, a picture in your mind of what the car looks like. It could be a red Audi, for instance. And so you tell a friend or a colleague about this, and the second you speak those words, you're essentially casting your thought form into physical reality, because you're speaking and your words then have a resonance attached to them, and they physically go through the air and part the airwaves as they go. They physically strike the eardrum of your friend that's listening, vibrate their eardrum, and then their brain processes that vibration. So just in that instant, you've transferred your thought forms to somebody else. That's the essence of magic, essentially. And then that person will then say, why don't we do whatever action it takes? So go and look at a showroom or go and look online. And so we take those actions, we find the car we like, we order it, and then within a few days it's there we're driving it. So that's a simple form of manifestation in its rawest form. And that's what spellcraft is. There's always a thought form to start with. then we verbalize it in some way, then we create some form of action, usually a symbolic one, and then there's a release. We let go of that initial thought form. And the idea is to drop it down into the subconscious so we don't put emotional and mental blocks on that idea. So we don't get in our own way, essentially. And we leave it up to the universe to deliver. Yeah.
Very interesting, very interesting. And I hope we will explore all those interconnections in a future podcast.
Yeah.
I hope that's not the last time you're coming here. So there's so much to explore. And you already mentioned that you are green witch. Yes, you're also an urban witch. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what type of witches are out there and what does it mean to be a green witch and urban witch?
Yeah. So, in terms of witchcraft types, I guess, there are kind of more or less unlimited types, but the sort of standard types that you get is if you imagine the whole umbrella term of witchcraft as a giant tree, and off the tree, there's lots of branches going in all different directions. And each branch will be a type of witch. And often lots of witches tend to just be generalists. We kind of take from various different disciplines and we utilize them in our practice. But there are certain witches who will direct most of their practice towards a certain branch. And for me, I'm a green witch, and green witches tend to be all based around plant magic of plants and trees, very much like the ancient druids would be in that sort of sense. We sort of see plants and trees as not just things to be exploited, but we see plants and trees as beings in their own right. They are sentient. They have their own sense of knowing and understanding, and we can develop close connections and relationships with trees and plants by some of the practices that we do. And I think developing that sort of mindset that trees and plants are beings in and of themselves, it helps you look at them in a completely different light to what most of us would look at trees. We go outside, we see a tree, it's mundane to us, we walk past it, we see it as an object. In our minds, it's no different really to a stone or a rock or a piece of wood. It's just a tree. But when you look at it in terms of how I would look at a tree, these are living sentient beings that live on a different time frame to how we live. You know, they live their lives on different time frames to us. And just because they're living on different time frames doesn't mean that they are unconnected to us. They are deeply connected to us. But I think we kind of don't give them the reverence that they deserve at times. And I think all of us would sort of say, you know, trees are important. Most people don't like to see a tree being cut down. And it's deep within us. We feel it deep within us. We know that it doesn't feel right to cut old ancient trees down. And that's, again, it's because our deep connection to nature has been there all along. It's been there from our very early beginnings as human beings. And I suppose with this type of practice, it helps us reconnect with that early reverence for nature. And so a part of my practice with trees is connection with plants. Plants are sentient. There's been a lot of research around plants and trees in recent years. And it's kind of discovered that plants are aware of our presence as humans. If we're close to them, plants know, you know, and they give off chemical signals through pheromones, through various movements of leaves and changes in their growth patterns. They can shift their focus of what they're doing according to the situation at the time. And a good example of this is when we cut grass, we mow the lawn and we smell that beautiful sort of grass, that fresh cut grass smell. But that grass smell is a chemical scream. It's a scream that's being put out there by the grass, basically warning other grasses in the area that it's being destroyed, that it's being killed. It's a chemical scream of genocide, if you like, that is warning other plants in the area. And so understanding that, then you start to look at them in a different way. You start to realize that they have a conscience. They have a consciousness that is wildly different to ours, and the way they communicate is wildly different to ours, but they still have a consciousness. Then you start to think, well, where does this consciousness come from? How does it relate to our own consciousness? And where does our consciousness come from? And I think all of us, you know, when we have a thought about anything, it arrives in our minds. We always say, you know, I had a thought the other day. It didn't just appear, it arrived from somewhere. And then we have to ask, well, where did it arrive from? And this is this whole thing about this web of connectivity with all things, with all beings, whether they're plants, rocks, trees, plants, people, animals, whatever they are, we are all connected in this intricate web, which we call nature. And so it's about understanding that and having an awareness of that, and also respecting that connection and that relationship that we do have. And therefore, you start to live your life in a more intentional and more aware way. And you're very careful about how you move through the world. I'm careful about how I interact with trees. I wouldn't just go and pick a leaf off a tree. I would be very careful about how I interact with trees and plants, because I regard them as having this consciousness, having this sentience. We know that plants and trees do have a sentience because they use the mycelium layer underneath the soil to transmit information to other plants and trees in the area. They can redirect nutrients to help a tree that's struggling for nutrients to grow better. Plants are able to redirect, and trees are able to redirect nutrients through the mycelium layer under the soil. So we know that they have a sentience. They are intelligent. They have an ability in how they live their lives. They have a will almost. And the same with things like fungi and mushrooms. Fungi are intelligent. They're able to solve simple problems, even sort of complete mazes and figure out quite complex problems. So we know that there is a consciousness there is a sentience. And I think being aware of that helps you to behave in a different way with plants and trees. And that's part of my green witchcraft, really. That's a big part of that. It's all around plant magic and how we cooperate rather than exploit plants and trees.
And I think people felt it throughout the history. Like you said, we all are connected. We don't feel good if we need to cut a big tree, and even small tree, just in general, to harm the tree. And I think there are so many examples in literature where people expressed that understanding of the trees and plants. We have a Battle of the Trees, Kat Gadeo, the book. Then in just fantasy books, the trees are helping to fight in Chronicles of Narnia and in many other books. So they are involved, they are connected, they communicate between each other. Also life trees. I think people feel this, and that's why they're bringing it in their books, in their writings to reflect that.
Yeah, and it's even in sort of ancient folklore, in the sort of Nordic sagas, in the Viking and sort of Norse sagas, we have Yggdrasil, which is the world tree that holds the 9 worlds together. We have various different trees in various different belief systems. We have the tree of life, and we have the tree in the Garden of Eden. And all of the belief systems have a tree of reverence in some shape or form. And we utilize trees and plants in a reverence type way. Druids had a huge form of reverence for trees and plants in their practice, their worship. And they even developed languages and stuff around the trees and folklore and ritualistic practices around each individual tree, even a zodiac system around the trees. So there's a lot of reverence for trees and plants throughout history, and it goes back thousands of years. So I think there is a huge reverence there. A lot of people kind of see it as a paradox. I live in the city, so we often think of the city as this big grey concrete kind of thing where there's not much greenery happening. Luckily for me, where we are in Nottingham, because in the past, Sherwood Forest was covering most of the country. So there's still a lot of green spaces in Nottingham, even though the city's quite a big city and it's been built up around there. We still have a lot of green spaces within Nottingham. And so we don't have to travel far to get to woodland and to get to quiet green spaces like that. So so I'm quite lucky. I'm able to marry the two quite easily in that way. Yeah, so it works.
Yeah, this is the topic of being an urban witch. Yeah. Yes, there is coming from that. So what is the urban witch and how to really connect to nature being in the city? Yes, so urban definitely is the witch in the city, yes? Yeah. So maybe you can share some of those tips how to connect with nature in the city.
I think really the biggest, it's about acknowledging and accepting that nature isn't a thing that's out there. Nature is, we are it and it is us. We're not indistinct. There is a complete connection there. an infinite connection between the natural world and ourselves because we are part of it. And I think having that understanding and realizing that, I think all of us, even if we don't practice any form of spirituality, I think if we stay in the house for 2 or 3 days and don't go outside, we feel that and we have an urge, a driving, unknown kind of force that wants to pull us outside because we feel trapped in, we feel quite claustrophobic. And people say, I have cabin fever. They have this need to get outside. And that's always been there too. We are from the outdoors. We are beings of the outdoors. We really shouldn't be in concrete boxes. We should be in the outdoors. But obviously, we love our comfort, so we've kind of come inward. But part of that connection with nature really is, as an urban witch, a big part of my practice is foraging. So I forage a lots of wild food. And it's surprising just how much wild foods and wild herbs and magical herbs are growing out of pavements, out of walls, out of fences and steps and things like that. And we find it all the time. It's all over the place. And we tend to walk past them and regard them as weeds. We tend to disregard them as just little plants growing out of bricks or something. But often, many of those plants that you step over every single day are superfoods, or they're magical medicines, plants, or they're medicines. We disregard them because we've lost that knowledge. I think many of us have kind of lost the knowledge that we would have had. Our ancient ancestors would have had all of this knowledge. They would have known because we lived outdoors. We were part of that system all the time. We've kind of cut ourselves off from that system in our modern times because we've built walls up around us, around ourselves, and we've contained ourselves in boxes. And so we've disconnected ourselves from that magical system, and therefore we've lost the knowledge of that magical system. And I think when we reconnect with that, what we start to realize is when we start to realize what's around us, then you start to realize that there's so much we can use out there. I have a cupboard in the kitchen that looks like something out of a 17th century apothecary. It's full of jars with roots and seeds and dried leaves and bits of bark and all kinds of stuff. And that's essentially a magical cupboard, but it's also medical as well. There are natural painkillers in there. There are natural analgesics, natural anti-inflammatories, all kinds of things that are useful in a medicinal sense. And it's because I've spent years sort of learning what they do and where to find them and what's around. And, simple things like nettles, stinging nettles is a really simple one. They're classed as a superfood. They've got more vitamin C than oranges and lemons. They're hugely anti-inflammatory, antioxidant. They can reduce symptoms of hay fever quite drastically. They're hugely medicinal, but because they sting us, we disregard them as weeds and we try to remove them from our gardens. Things like the willow tree. Willow bark and leaves contain salicylic acid, and that's one of the ingredients in aspirin. It's a huge painkiller. It's a brilliant painkiller and anti-inflammatory that we can use for migraines, for aches and pains, backache, toothache, all of that stuff. And it's such a simple thing. It's free. But obviously, that's not marketed to us because they can't charge for that. We don't know it. We get sort of removed from it and we're told, you shouldn't have anything that you don't know, that a doctor's not prescribed and all of that stuff. And we don't. But yes, I've kind of built up that knowledge over the years. And so now, we take a lot of natural medicines. We have natural teas and tinctures and balms and various things that I make using natural ingredients. And it's just because I've spent years sort of learning how to do it. I guess I've spent years sort of reconnecting with our naturality, I think.
I was born in Lithuania, so it was the Soviet Union at that time. And what was interesting that the herbal medicine was very popular. First of all, of course, parents still were taught by their parents what to take, in which conditions, and the doctors would give you certain prescription and a prescription for herbs. That was absolutely normal. They would say, okay, you have this, okay, so this is, you can take this medicine and you can take these herbs. And if you would come to the store, and I was traveling, of course, throughout the whole former Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, wherever I would go to, to those places, if you would come to the pharmacy, it would have the whole section with all kinds of herbs, herbal teas, tinctures, everything. Starting from valeriana root, just to calm you down, to calendula, to the oak bark, everything. And it would say, this is for lungs, this is for your kidneys, this is for headaches, and so on and so forth. In some countries, South American countries, that's still the case.
Yeah, and many African countries, it's still the case too. And I think there are some in Europe, but not like it used to be. I think we've kind of been hijacked by this westernized kind of allopathic medicine way of doing things. And I think because many of the sort of authoritative bodies around that have kind of outlawed certain herbs. Over in the UK, a couple of years ago, we had a lot of herbs and ancient natural remedies that we've used for thousands of years. We had them outlawed. They said that you weren't allowed to use them. If you used them and gave them to someone else, then it'd be classed as kind of dealing drugs, essentially. And so the regulations and the laws around this stuff is quite tight in the UK. There's quite a lot of restrictions here for how, obviously they can't sort of control how you use it for your own personal use, but at least for prescribing to others or giving to others is a grey area. And you have to be trained as a clinical herbalist to be able to do that and have all of the accreditations and paperwork and all of that stuff. Yeah, it's definitely not easy, but it is what we did for thousands of years, and we managed to make it this far. So it clearly works.
Yes. And speaking about that, obviously for so many years, we were dealing as humans with a lot of misconceptions about witches, witchcraft. So what are, in your opinion, 3 major misconceptions about witches and witchcrafts, maybe magic in general?
I would say the biggest one is that witches are worshipping the devil. That's the biggest one for me. Witchcraft and paganism and witchcraft tends to be put in the same pot as each other, really. And the two are quite different. There are, you don't have to be pagan to be a witch, and you don't have to be a witch to be pagan. The two are quite different. And pagan is a big umbrella term that encompasses lots of different kinds of spiritual practice in vast amounts of different cultures. And it essentially just means more than one god. You're worshipping more than a set of gods. Whereas witchcraft, you don't have to worship any gods. I don't worship any gods myself. So I wouldn't regard myself as a pagan. Even though I align with many pagan practices, I don't regard myself as a pagan because of the fact that I don't worship any gods. A big misconception is that witches are connected to the devil and Satan and demons and all of this stuff. And all of that is a Christianized thing. It's come from the Catholic Church in the sort of 1400s. And it really stems from the publication of a book in the 1400s called the Malleus Maleficarum. It was by a guy called Heinrich Kramer. He was a fanatic preacher who was deeply misogynistic. The book itself is a hugely misogynistic book. It's where he uses the word witch. What he actually means is women. He has a deep hatred for women, and he doesn't hide it. He makes no efforts to hide this fact. So he regards women as witches, he regards them as a weak species who are easily corruptible by the devil. And that's essentially where we get the idea that women are witches, that witches are only women, and it's all connected to devil worship and Satanism and all of that stuff. It's because of his book was the second most popular and most distributed book alongside the Bible at the time. It had the official stamp of Pope Gregory at the time. And also it had the sign-off of King James I of England. He signed it off. It had his sort of seal of approval. And round about, within a couple of hundred years of that, we also had a book by James I himself called Demonology, because he was also obsessed with demons and the nature of the devil being around all the time, and we're always susceptible to the devil. So he released a book called Demonology where he described many types of demons and how to spot a demon and how to deal with witches and so on. And these became kind of like the manuals for the witch trials of the 16 and 1700s. So we see this misogynistic kind of shifts from that. So one of the biggest misconceptions is the connection to the devil and to Satan and demons. The devil and Satan isn't a figure who is recognized within paganism. He's not a figure within witchcraft belief. He's not a figure within paganism. Most witches don't recognize the devil as a thing. You can't worship something you don't believe in, right? So the devil is purely an Abrahamic religion figure, is purely a Christianized figure. He's not a figure of witchcraft or paganism. And so we have no connections to the devil. Witches don't have a connection to the devil. In modern times, we have kind of neo-occultists, neo-Satanists who are connected to the Church of Satanism from like the 60s and 70s. So it's fairly relatively modern, really. And the whole concept of the devil and Satan is really quite Christianized in its method. So that would be the biggest misconception. I think another one is that witches are only women. Obviously, that's not the case because here I am. But I think it's been a kind of trope across time, from the Middle Ages particularly, with the fact that witches are only women. That again comes from the Malleus Maleficarum and the sort of misogynistic views of that. What's interesting is that's only a very sort of a UK, America, and European sort of version. If we go to other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, the majority of people tried for witchcraft during the witch trials were men. In Denmark and Iceland, the vast majority of those tried were men. And in Iceland, particularly Icelandic magic, there was very few women practicing magic at all because it was seen as a masculine thing. It was seen as a male-dominated area of study. So, particularly Icelandic magic was almost solely practiced by men. And the same in lots of other parts of the world. So the whole concept that this is kind of a female-orientated practice, it's not really true. Yes, in Europe at least, and in the UK, the majority of people tried and executed as witches were women, but there was still 1 in 4 men that were tried and executed as witches during that period of time too. And again, in America as well, with the Salem witch trials, there were men who were also tried and executed, one of them being Giles Corey, who was pressed to death. He was trying to protect his family and he wouldn't give in. So they pressed him to death with a board and lots of rocks on top until he was crushed. He suffered as a witch. I think another big misconception, the final kind of big misconception really, is that during the witch trials, we always say, there's this whole trope within feminism, particularly where it's talked about, we are the daughters of the witches they couldn't burn. And it's a bit of a nonsensical term because no witches were burned in the witch trials. These were innocent women and men who were killed because of religious fervor and hysteria. Nobody was a witch, because the term witch at the time was purely used for harmful magic that was given to you by the devil. And nobody had that because the devil doesn't exist. It's not a real thing. So there were no witches that were killed during the witch trials. There were innocent people who were killed during the witch trials. And that was it. And I think we kind of forget that. And so we demonize these people. And obviously, now there's a lot more sympathy and empathy towards those people who did suffer during those trials. But we still refer to them as witches. We still say those witches were burned and hanged during this witch trial. But none of them were witches. They were just people. And most of them were Christians. Most of them were deeply devout Christians, but were caught up in a time when it was full of hysteria. Yeah, so I think those are kind of the 3 big misconceptions around witchcraft, really.
Thank you so much. And are there any personality traits or any mindset qualities that help a person to become a witch? In general, how to become a witch? And I know that there are different looks at that. Some people say that you should should have something in your blood that is being transferred, which I think is reflected also in Harry Potter books. Yes, in a way that theme. Or you can become like Hermione Granger through studies in the same book and really curiosity and strong will to learn. Yeah. So what is your take on that?
Within the witchcraft community, you see this all the time, and you kind of see people saying, I was born a witch. And that statement is also a nonsensical statement. Nobody is born a witch. Nobody is born knowing how to be a witch. Witchcraft is a way of life. So you can't be born as a witch, because even if you're born into a household where your parents practice witchcraft, it still takes time to learn what it is that they're practicing, right? Nobody's born knowing how to be a witch. And so I always find that quite an amusing thing to hear, and it's generally nonsensical. But I think really for being a witch is a big part of it. It's an open-mindedness and an understanding that the world isn't as we're told it is. We're programmed from an early age to believe that the world is the way that we're told it is. And it's just not true. As we go through life, we start to see things and experience things that are very different to what we think of the world. We start to realize that politicians lie. We start to realize that governments can't be trusted particularly. We start to realize that many of our systems and organizations aren't really for the good of the people. They're for the good of people that want to get rich, and powerful entities. So I think that's kind of a good start. You start to see things in a different way. And the idea with witchcraft is a way of life. It's not a religion at all. And as we said earlier, there's an unlimited way of practicing as a witch. My practice as a witch is entirely different to the practices of other witches. Some people are Wiccan, which is a religion. So they will practice in a different way to how I practice. So there's no kind of right or wrong. I guess the way to get into witchcraft in that way is have an open mind, learn to redevelop and redefine our connection with nature. I think being in the natural world helps you to kind of reconnect with your natural magic anyway. You start to feel that we are connected to something bigger than just ourselves. If you spend time outside, you spend time outside, you spend time with pets or animals, wild animals, you start to feel that we are somehow connected. You feel that. And so it's about sort of developing your intuition and developing your senses to be heightened to those ways of being. And I think for me, a big part of my practice is balance. I have my balancing stones behind me as a visual sculpture to remind me to maintain my own balance, my own inner balance. For me, balance is a key factor of it for me. Balancing mind, balancing body, balancing spirituality, balancing thoughts, balancing what we say, how we act, how we react, and how we balance our emotions. I think it's about being in touch with, and not just the natural world, but about being in touch with ourselves, being in touch with other people, and understanding that we are all connected in this kind of giant web. I think there's so many different ways of study, so many different types of study. The biggest way to get started, I guess, is just to be curious. I think always stay curious. I think that's the biggest thing. If you're curious about something, find the answer to it. And what you tend to find is the more you dig, the more you find. And then the more you find, the more questions you have. And then the more you dig into those. And it goes on and on and on. And I think curiosity and imagination are the biggest assets we have, I think, in order to reconnect with our magic again.
Thank you. And today you mentioned your interest in folklore, in legends and history. Can you share maybe some literature sources that might give our listeners a feel for what is real magic, what is real witchcraft, the natural connection that you talked about today? Even it's a fictional book, it doesn't matter, but gives that feel.
Yeah. I mean, any of the sort of ancient mythologies, myths and legends, particularly through in the modern times, we're quite familiar with Nordic gods, for instance, like Thor and Odin and Loki, mostly from superhero movies in modern times. But that kind of mythology, it has a lot of lessons to kind of teach us. And even if we look at the names of the days of our weeks, right? Tuesday is based on the Nordic god Tu. Wednesday is based on the Nordic god Odin or Woden. And Thursday is based on the Nordic god Thor, the god of thunder and lightning. And Friday is based on the Nordic god Frigg or Frey. And so even our basic days of the week are based on ancient folklore and mythology. And then we have the names of our planets like Mars and Venus and Saturn. They're all Roman gods and Greek gods. I think studying any of the ancient pantheons of gods and goddesses and mythology and myths and legends and kind of digging into the stories of those help us to kind of start to peel away the layers. Things like Roman mythology, Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, Nordic mythology, Slavic mythology, African mythology, whatever culture you are, study your own local myths and legends and your own local folklore, and you'll have local sayings or rhymes or little phrases that people use in your locality that will have a basis in this sort of magical past that we lived in. It's starting to pick apart things that we regard as everyday, often don't have everyday origins. So it's starting to pick apart the origins of those mundane things, and then you start to find the magic in the mundane. And that's where you really start to develop this understanding that things aren't as we first think they are. We disregard the days of the week because we use them all the time. We just know all the time. But they have origins in ancient mythology and gods and goddesses and magic and worship and monsters and giants and all of this stuff, winged horses, the lot. They all have origins in these ancient stories. So picking apart the stories helps us to understand our world that we have now. And so the more we dig into the stories, the more we understand where we are now and how we got here. And I think that's the key to unlocking the magic that we all have in us, really.
Thank you so much. And as we're nearing the end of our podcast, I know that we covered many questions, different topics. Maybe there is something that I haven't asked you, but you would like to share with our listeners before we end.
Connect with yourself and with the natural world is what I would say is the biggest thing to do for each of us. You know, whether you wish to embark on the path of a witch or whether you just are curious or whether you just want to do it for health reasons, you know, grounding and connecting to the earth again, taking shoes and socks off and walking on grass and walking in water and in the sea, on the beach, wherever, putting your hands in soil, connecting with trees and so on. You know, it sounds like it's kind of hippie new age stuff, but it isn't. It's really ancient stuff that we all did in our prehistory. You know, we all had this relationship with the natural world, but we've kind of slipped away from it and lost it a little bit. And if you want to learn more, part of the whole point in what we do with Silver Crow is to help dispel some of the myths around witchcraft and around the use of magic and help empower people to reconnect with that magic that we all have that is around us all the time and redevelop our relationship with the natural world in a way that is sort of holistic and beneficial to us. We have a website that's silvercrow.uk, and that's got a load of information. There's loads of free blogs and various different posts and audio content on there, video stuff. We have our podcast, which is the Urban Witch Podcast, which is on YouTube and all of the other audio places. We hold a weekly space over on X, which is a live discussion space that happens every Wednesday, where I discuss with some of my other magical brothers and sisters across the world. We hold various different conversations about all kinds of magical topics. The one this week is all about cultural appropriation within magic and witchcraft, but we hold topics about all kinds of magical subjects. So you can join that live and listen in, or you can just grab a mic and join the conversation. So that's also something we do. And then we also offer various courses and workshops on our website where I teach this stuff. You know, I teach how to start your journey on the path of witchcraft and redevelop your magic.
Thank you so much. And we will add all this information in our podcast notes so that our listeners can join and listen. And I can attest that that's a wonderful website with lots of resources. I truly value it. And I already mentioned the Urban Witch podcast today in our conversation.
Yeah.
I think it has so much useful information, and I appreciate you doing it, and I hope you will continue with that podcast. So I am now your listener.
Thank you.
And looking forward to your podcast. So Thank you very much, Shaun. It's been a great pleasure
Thank
talking to
you.
you. Appreciate all your valuable insights. Wish you all the best, and I truly hope that we will meet again on this podcast to discuss more topics. So, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dear listeners, I hope you found our Magical Professions podcast episode insightful. As we concluded, I'd like to extend a heartfelt invitation to all of you. Your stories, encounters, and knowledge are invaluable to us, and we want you to be a part of this mystical journey. Have you ever had a brush with a magical profession, a strange encounter, or stumbled upon hidden knowledge? Do you possess ancient scrolls, widespread tales, or first hand experiences that you believe belong in the spotlight? Are you aware of a sci fi or fantasy book or a movie with magical professionals in it? We want to hear from you. At Magical Professions, we cherish the power of collective wisdom and the magic of shared experiences. So don't be shy. Reach out to us with your stories, sources, or any information about magical professions you would like to share. You can connect with us via email at magicalprofessions@gmail.com or through our social media channels. Your contribution could become the heart of a future episode, and together we'll weave an even richer tapestry of wonder. Thank you for joining us on this mystical journey. Remember, the magic is not just in the stories we tell, but in the connections we make. Until next time, keep the magic alive, and may your world be ever more enchanting. I'm your host, Almuda, signing off, and I can't wait to hear from you.